Myles Garrett hasn't had less than 14 sacks since 2019, so even if you're a casual enjoyer of the game, you know that he's at least one of the few elite players at his position. But there is no clear and easy stat that suggests someone is an elite cornerback. And in my opinion, this is why it took a down year from high-end pass rushers and Trey Hendrickson not being a sexy enough name for a cornerback to win Defensive Player of the Year for the second time since 2009. Do bear in mind that before winning the Super Bowl, the Eagles signed Saquon Barkley, but they also spent both their first and second round picks on the cornerback position. And this cornerback class is far better. The overwhelming number of good cornerbacks in this class means your team will have a chance to select one regardless of your draft position. If you do enjoy the content, please consider liking and subscribing as it greatly supports the channel. I'll begin by quickly running through some of these names I have as Day 3 or UDFA evaluations. At 19, I've got Darian Porter. 18 is Kobe Bryant. 17 is Denzel Burke. 16, I've got Zay Alexander. 15 is Quincy Riley. 14 is O'Donnell Fortune. 13 is Mello Dotson. And at 12, I've got Dorian Strong. If you do have any questions about why I'm a bit lower on any of those guys, feel free to leave them in the comments below. But this is where I feel like it starts to get interesting. At number 11, I have Jacob Parrish out of Kansas State. Just barely rounding up to 5'10" with 31-inch arms, he'll likely play predominantly as a nickel in the league, although Parrish has a tendency to play out of control, lose his balance, which is amplified when he is taking snaps out of the slot. His best trait is his speed, which shows up both on the film and with his 4.35 40-yard dash. This will particularly excite certain teams because an explosive nickel who is always lurking and ready to blitz on any given snap can be exactly the weapon needed to keep the quarterback on edge. I believe his value is going to be in off-man coverage, where he can let the receiver come onto him first and then pounce. He tackles consistently, which is important with a nickel, and we've also seen a bit of a trend with slot receivers becoming more explosive as much as reliable, and Parrish obviously has the speed to run with those guys. So there is some Day 2 value here. He will probably find issues against the likes of Garrett Wilson and Ladd McConkey, slot receivers who can really stick their foot in the ground and change direction with ease, because as I've mentioned, Parrish does need some work on his balance and his instinctual ability to not overcommit his hips in one direction. The Steelers are a team that jumps out to me who could use a nickel and would get creative with the way they use him, and even more so the Jets, who actually have very few holes on their roster. One thing they don't have is their own version of Brian Branch. New Jets head coach Aaron Glenn was able to make the most of Brian Branch's skill set with the Lions, so maybe this can be his shiny new toy for even less than the second round pick that Branch cost the Lions. At number 10, I have Noel Williams out of California. 6 foot, 190 pounds with average arm length. He ran a 4.5 flat 40-yard dash at the combine, so everything about him physically is good enough to survive in the league as a starter, but certainly nothing that excites you physically. But as you'll find out in this video, I like cornerbacks who played a lot of man coverage coming out of college and have displayed their ability to do so successfully. The reason being is that most of these prospects are going to be fine in zone coverage. A cornerback who can survive in man coverage, run step for step, one-on-one with an elusive receiver, and truly shut that receiver down, that's where the value is. So with this in mind, Noel Williams had the second most man coverage snaps in this cornerback class. With him not being the biggest, there were quite a few times where he gave up receptions to bigger receivers even if he was all over them. He just couldn't compete with the size. And when he wasn't playing press man coverage, he definitely gave up too much cushion. However, he has the fluidity to stick to receivers, and this fact alone makes me willing to draft him in the 3rd or 4th round, because he'll never be a top 10 corner in the league, but I could easily see him being the second best cornerback on a team and genuinely holding his own. He is also one of, if not the most competitive cornerback in this class. To be honest, he seemed to be constantly looking for a fight. So I listened to some of his interviews to make sure it wasn't like a toxic attitude thing, and I actually found him to be very likable. The guy is just a true competitor. He wants to win. He cares about his craft. And that really does make a difference when you're investing in a player. This is someone who can slot straight into a winning culture, fill a hole on a team and not look out of place, and he's not going to cost you more than a mid to late day 2 pick and maybe even a day 3 pick. My number 9 is probably someone you've started to hear a bit more about recently, because Maxwell Hairston's blazing 4.28 40-yard dash is the fastest time we've seen this year, and more importantly, it shows up on the tape. He missed a large proportion of the season with a shoulder injury, and injuries are likely to be something he has to battle with in his NFL career, weighing in at just 5'11", 183 pounds with 31-inch arms. But if he can stay healthy, his speed means I don't think he'll necessarily have to play out of the slot exclusively like some of these other smaller guys. But scheme is going to be the key for Hairston. He played a very limited number of man coverage snaps for Kentucky, and if he was to be forced into the wrong scheme, I think a lack of fluidity in his hips would start to show up. But a team like the Minnesota Vikings and that Brian Flores-led defense spring to mind for me. Flores runs a scheme where the focus is keeping the receivers in front of the DBs. The Vikings have a pretty complete football team right now, but an explosive cornerback who can play this off-man coverage role to perfection is something they are lacking. Hairston may still be mastering the safe distance to maintain between him and his receiver, but his ability to get out of his back pedal and pounce means the quarterback should always be wary when throwing in his direction. For the majority of teams, Hairston's inability in man coverage should make him a late day 2 or early day 3 pick. But for teams that are looking to deploy zone or off-man coverage almost exclusively, I could understand him being taken in the first round. In order to avoid repeating myself, I should state that my evaluation of the 8th ranked cornerback in my ranking, Jahdae Barron, is a very similar evaluation to the one that I've just given with Maxwell Hairston. Just like Hairston, he played off-man or zone coverage almost exclusively. He ran a 4.39 40-yard dash. He has managed to put a bit more weight on than Hairston, but his sub-30-inch arms are going to make the idea of playing on the outside and competing with the more lengthy ex-receivers a bit ambitious. So probably a nickel, and with an almost empty sample size when it comes to press man coverage, I don't think that's what he'll be asked to do. And I mentioned the Eagles drafting the 2 cornerbacks earlier. I didn't release a cornerback ranking last year, but I certainly wasn't as high as everyone else on Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, because if I remember correctly, DeJean had a real tightness in his hips, and Quinyon Mitchell played nothing but zone or off-man coverage. But then even if I don't think these types of cornerbacks are going to fit most schemes, they're only going to be drafted by a team running a scheme that they do fit. So yes, I have Hairston and Jahdae Barron a bit low, but it's not because I expect them to fail. I expect them to be great for one of a handful of teams where the whole premise of their defensive system is keeping the receivers in front of the defensive backs. However, the fact that for most teams they wouldn't even be in the conversation until at least day 2 if I was the GM means that these guys fall behind some of the more scheme-flexible prospects. In terms of why I have Barron ahead of Hairston, Hairston has the traits to master this style of coverage, but I think Barron more or less already has mastered this style of coverage. Great instinct, great ball skills, and of course the speed and burst to pounce. Quite possibly the most underrated cornerback in this class is my number 7, Elijah Huzzie out of North Carolina. I have a second round evaluation on him because he is the last prospect we are going to speak about who doesn't project favourably on the outside. He's 5'10" and his arm length is 29 5/8, which is actually the exact same measurement as Jahdae Barron. But Huzzie did play on the outside this year. It was a combination of press and off-man coverage, but I thought he thrived in both. He has the instincts to play effective zone or off-man coverage, but in press man coverage, he is in the receiver's pocket, step for step, rep for rep, just all over receivers like a rash because he is super fluid. And despite being a bit smaller, he's actually very stocky. So even playing on the outside this year, a combination of his stockiness, his competitiveness, and his hand-eye coordination meant that he had a higher forced incompletion rate than any other player we'll be discussing in this video. And he even had a higher snaps per reception rate than Travis Hunter. There are some players who I'm high on to begin with, but then I know the more people watch the film, the more a great prospect's name is going to rise on draft boards. I don't know with Huzzy. I'm not seeing him being projected higher than a day 3 pick. I'm personally projecting him to go in the 4th round because I have to assume that a team will see what I'm seeing, at least to some extent. But his lack of length and the fact that he doesn't possess blazing speed means that people just can't get excited about him. But this is a slightly slower Trent McDuffie to me. Any team that needs a slot corner, regardless of scheme, should be looking to draft this guy in the 2nd round. In fact, if there weren't so many good cornerbacks in this class, I would be saying draft him in the 1st round. At number 6, I've got Will Johnson out of Michigan, and this one is going to seem more controversial than I mean it to be. And so just to be clear, if Johnson was in last year's class, he's probably my number 1 cornerback. Unfortunately, like a few of these top guys, Will Johnson missed the majority of the season with turf toe. So this in itself is something that nobody seems to be talking about. Turf toe doesn't sound like anything serious, but being quite literally on your toes is a vital part of being a cornerback. And turf toe has been the beginning of the end to a couple of wide receivers' careers, such as AJ Green and Julio Jones, because it can really affect your ability to push off the way a receiver or a cornerback needs to. As a Commanders fan, I think it went under the radar, but Terry McLaurin had an entire year of not looking quite the same because of a turf toe injury before bouncing back this season. So that's one thing that isn't ideal. He also played almost entirely zone or off-man coverage. Now, we've spoken about why that's not my cup of tea, but this is a different conversation to what we had with Maxwell Hairston and Jahdae Barrett, because this is not someone with elite speed. He is very smooth, and he might have a chance to play some press man coverage successfully due to his size and length. I don't think he'll be asked to do it because he doesn't have that top end speed, which actually isn't the be all and end all for me. The major concern I have is tightness in his hips. And it's a largely hidden flaw due to the style of coverage he's playing, but he also makes up with it most of the time with his instincts. But in the NFL, Will Johnson is a zone coverage cornerback. And this is one where I think it is going to be more zone coverage as opposed to just off-man coverage. The difference being, in case you're unsure, because it does usually look the same, zone coverage means he will be responsible for a zone, obviously. So this will take advantage of his instincts to be in the right place so that when the ball is thrown, he doesn't have to shift and cover the ground so quickly because he is not so much adjusting to the receiver's movement. He's really just going to be reading the quarterback's eyes, and his instincts mean he should be in the right place to use his length and his ball skills to make a play. He will have to play some sort of man coverage in the NFL. Obviously, no team plays exclusively zone coverage, and so off-man coverage is probably the way forward. But I worry because off-man coverage means you're not staying right up close to the receiver, but as soon as the receiver changes direction or the ball gets thrown to them, you need to be able to pounce and make up that ground very quickly. And Will Johnson's been okay at that in college. I don't know if he's going to be able to do it that successfully in the NFL. This is also exactly the situation where his turf toe injury, if it does linger into his NFL career, could really affect his ability to push off and make up that ground. But the teams that I think would be perfect for Will Johnson are the Cardinals, the Bears, and the Bucks. Those are the 3 teams where I would really like to see him go, and I think he would find success. But again, there are quite a lot of teams where if I'm the GM, I'm not going to be convinced that he can survive in a scheme that isn't particularly zone heavy. The biggest wildcard of this cornerback class is my number 5, Shavon Revel. He has 3 major red flags, starting with injury. He played just 3 games last season before he tore his ACL in practice and missed the rest of the season. He is reportedly on track to be healthy before the start of the season, but who knows how ambitious that is and whether he'll have full fitness straight away. The second red flag is competition. He's played for East Carolina for the entirety of his 3-season college career, and obviously this is a small school, so he wasn't displaying his ability against NFL-caliber receivers for the most part, although he did face Michigan in week 2 of his sophomore season, who had Roman Wilson at the time, and he held his own. However, the third red flag was that even against weaker competition, he was playing predominantly off-man coverage. But here's the caveat with the off-man coverage thing. Most of these guys are playing off-man or zone coverage because the coaches have recognised a tightness in the hips. But I don't necessarily think this is true with Siobhan Ravel, because the glimpses I caught of him truly having to flip his hips and change direction, he looked pretty sharp. So if he gets healthy and the small sample size of him changing direction is a fair representation of his ability, you've not only got a good starting corner, but it could be Christian Gonzalez, who fell far lower than he should have in 2023. That guy is a true shutdown corner because he's got all the traits as well as the fluidity. Siobhan Ravel is 6'2", 194 pounds, with 32.5-inch arms, which is actually a touch bigger than Gonzalez, if anything. He didn't run a 40-yard dash because of the injury, but I think he's got some real explosion. So this is a risk, but I think it's a well-calculated risk if you're taking him at the end of the first round, because I've got a feeling that Siobhan Ravel is going to be the real deal. The fact that Benjamin Morrison comes in as my number 4 is really kind of insane because I am such a big fan of Morrison. But this is another guy who missed most of the season with injury. For him, it was a season-ending hip surgery, which obviously isn't ideal for a cornerback, and it may be something that lingers into the beginning of his NFL career. And the other negative with Morrison is that he could use some work on his eye discipline. Sometimes he just gets too comfortable or misjudges the space between him and the receiver, but he didn't even have a full 3 healthy seasons in college. He'll be just turning 21 by the time the draft comes. So this is just one of those things that the more experienced players have mastered. Morrison has a good personality and I'm sure he'll improve on this. Apart from that, okay, he's not the biggest at 6 foot, 193 pounds and only 30.5-inch arms, but he's a shutdown corner. I don't believe anyone in this video played more press man coverage, and he consistently showed the fluidity and short area quickness that will allow him to stick to some of the best receivers in the NFL. I also think he's got some real speed to him and has great hand-eye coordination to break up passes despite a lack of length, so I think he'll hold his own on the outside. Morrison's character and youth mean that I trust him to clean up a couple of things and do everything that's required in his injury recovery. At number 3, I have Trey Amos, a well-travelled and experienced cornerback who finished his 5-year college career with Ole Miss. He's got enough size at 6'1", 195 pounds and 31.25-inch arms, and his 4.43 40-yard dash matches his good enough, although not outstanding, speed on the field. Having played a blend of different coverages, he has the instincts to play zone, and he certainly has the fluidity to play press man coverage. Just extremely smooth, changes direction with ease, and I mentioned the word instinct, which gets thrown around left, right and centre, but the experience really shows up with Amos. He's genuinely a step ahead. And when listening to him interview, he definitely seems a bit shy and reserved, but I don't think that's a bad thing at all with Amos because I get the impression that he isn't fussed with the hype and the media nonsense. He just wants to spend every day focusing on his craft and continuing to improve. I won't ramble too much on Amos. I really don't think it's that complicated. He's got everything. Amos had more pass breakups than anyone in this video last season, and I expect to see more of the same in the NFL. Let's be really clear about Azariah Thomas. There is not a huge difference between him and my number one corner. It's neck and neck. The one thing you can say about Thomas is that the speed isn't outstanding, which is probably why he didn't run a 40-yard dash, but I don't think he's too slow. He can definitely run with some fast receivers, and if it's a Jamar Chase, a Malik Neighbors, a Tyreek Hill, then okay, this isn't going to be his matchup. What most teams do against those guys is they make sure to have a free safety lurking in their direction to make sure that the deep ball is covered. And that's all the criticism I have for Azariah Thomas. He's got great size, long arms, he played a ton of press man defense and displayed sticky coverage time and time again. Quite simply, his combination of size and fluidity made this an easy evaluation for me. Not that I think this will happen, but if I'm the Jags at 5 or the Raiders at 6 and my number one corner is off the board and you don't like any of the quarterbacks, I would be tempted by Azariah Thomas. I would consider it for the Panthers at 8, and then you have a run of teams that aren't desperate for a cornerback. But if I'm the Broncos at 20 and he's on the board, I am sprinting that thing to the podium. Thomas had a snaps per reception rate that was second highest out of 129 cornerbacks eligible to be drafted this year. If you're wondering who was number one in snaps per reception out of the 129 cornerbacks in this class, that was Gavin Pringle out of Georgia State. So I won't jump the gun because we'll be speaking about Gav in a minute anyway at number 1. But Azariah Thomas turns 21 in June, making him the youngest prospect in this video. He's got great character, he's a true competitor, and most importantly, he is a future shutdown corner in the NFL. No controversy at number 1 as Travis Hunter leads the pack in a talented cornerback class. I'm not convinced that playing both receiver and cornerback would be a wise decision in terms of trying to keep an 188-pound player healthy, but I suppose there is a small boost in his value because if you do want to throw the odd play in here and there where you think he's perfect as a receiver, then fine, but as a cornerback he's fantastic. As I say, he is lightweight, so if the Giants do draft him at 3, it's going to be interesting to see if they try to match him up with AJ Brown twice a year. But most of the good receivers in the NFL right now aren't the AJ Brown prototype anymore. I found Hunter to be the most fluid and smooth athlete in this class. Lots of man coverage. He's playing against a lower competition, but I'm not someone who's going to blow that out of proportion when I can clearly see that his movement skills will match up brilliantly with NFL receivers. He's a very instinctual player. He's got the ball skills, obviously, being a part-time receiver. I don't think he's lightning fast, but he's definitely got enough speed. So would I draft him within the first 3 picks? I don't know. But that'll be a conversation for when I get through all the positions and release a mock draft. So there you have it. That's my cornerback ranking. I will say that those top 5, there's really not much in it between any of them. I think the top 4 will be great. I think Siobhan Ravel will probably be a success, and if he is, then he could easily be the best cornerback in this class. Jahdae Barron, Maxwell Hairston, and Will Johnson are all cornerbacks who I also think will be a success, but they are scheme-specific. I don't think Noel Williams and Jacob Parrish will ever be huge names in the league, but I think they've got a real chance of being solid NFL cornerbacks. And do make sure to keep an eye out for Elijah Huzzie, because he's only at 7 due to the fact that he is probably limited to the slot. But I really do think he's going to go in the 4th, 5th, 6th round and pop up on everyone's radar as one of the best slot cornerbacks in the NFL. If you do enjoy the content, please consider liking and subscribing. It's appreciated more than you know, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time with my edge ranking.